Welcome to the screencast for Chapter 1, screencast number 3. In this screencast, we will consider one of the factors that's both a biological indicator and an explanation for what happened to the rise of CO2 and temperature on the Earth. So that biological indicator and that underlying factor is the extreme rise in the human population size. The current human population size, when I first started using this textbook, was 6.8 billion people. Then it was 7.2 billion. Now we're close to 7.4 billion. Think about the idea of what a billion is. If you're interested in trying to understand why you can't understand a number that's so big, I do have an additional video posted on Moodle that you can view to help understand this concept of billion. So over 1 million additional people are added to Earth every 5 days. So here we're going to take a brief introductory look at a graph which shows the change in human population size. And here, right here, you see the 0 point from which we've been counting forward into the Common Era, and we are currently in the year 2020. So we'll be up here a little bit further, and we're at 7.4, so we're right about here. And before the time 0 point, we have before the Common Era, and we are going back thousands of years to at least 8,000 BCE, 8,000 before the Common Era, when agriculture was invented. And we even have some estimates from earlier, all the way back to about 2 million years ago for the human population size. Now, if we were to focus on this graph maybe all the way through to, let's say, the year 0, and we spread that graph out, you would see that there are increases and dips, increases and dips in the human population size. But there's a dramatic shift when you get to about, 1400, and certainly even more, mostly it's 1600. So in around 1400, 1348 to 1350, there was the plague or Black Death. And as you can see, it caused a significant dip in population size. And we will look at that later when we look at disease and health. And maybe we have some lessons from that we can apply to COVID-19. But overall, you'll see that from 1600 onward, the population increased exponentially. So very, very, very sharply. And we'll look at how that happened and why that happened. But the overall impact of increased human population size is one of the factors that affected the change in global temperature and global CO2 emissions. The other factor, which isn't featured here, but will help you to understand why the impact on the Earth in terms of temperature and CO2 has increased so dramatically, is that the cause of this, or the reason this increase in population could occur, is multifactorial, but it includes the Industrial Revolution, which began in England, in Britain, and then expanded to the United States and other countries. And along with that came changes to understanding sanitation, changes to understanding how diseases are spread, and changes to understanding what happens during birth that could lead to either infant mortality or mortality for the mother. And all of these things put together have allowed for this sharp increase in human population, and again led to the sharp increase in other issues. So this is a picture of Calcutta, India, but it could really be many other places in the world, both developing countries, such as India, Vietnam, and developed countries such as the United States. You saw that picture of Los Angeles. You may have been to New York or seen pictures of the streets of New York. This super crowding, super closeness of people has a number of effects, one of them being, of course, the spread of disease. It's almost, frankly, amazing to me that a COVID-type situation has not occurred too frequently previously when you consider how close we all are together. So that's it for human population size and as a global indicator. Next, we'll look at resource depletion, which is, of course, involved with the whole human population size, but there are also other factors. So, another environmental indicator is resource depletion. So as the human population size grows larger and larger, the resources necessary for our survival become increasingly depleted. So let's look at some of these resources that are becoming increasingly depleted. Some are natural resources, such as energy resources, coal, oil, uranium, natural gas. These are finite in quantity and cannot be renewed or reused. There are other natural resources, such as aluminum or copper, that also exist in finite amounts, but at least they can be recycled. So that's a look at overall resource depletion. But when we look around the globe, we find that not all countries and all societies are equally depleting our natural resources. So let's take a look at that. So countries can be divided based on their level of development. Development means improvement in human well-being through economic advancement. So that means that as an economy advances, people have more money to do things like obtain food, heat their homes, heat their homes or use other resources. And so countries are divided, or societies are divided into two categories, developed nations and developing nations. We no longer say first world and third world countries. A developed nation is one that has been developed economically, such that they've achieved an improvement in human well-being. Developing nations are countries that are still working on that. So a country such as Vietnam would be considered a developing nation because they are working toward economic improvements which will lead to improvements in human well-being. Now, if we look at these two categories of development, we see that developed nations, you might have guessed anyway, deplete resources more or disproportionately to developing nations. So an example here is automobiles and trucks. In the green, developed nations such as the United States and the European Union. We have almost 90% of automobiles and trucks, whereas only 13% of this resource is used by people in developing nations. Meat and fish, it's a little more even. You have less, 45% by developed nations, 55% by developing nations. The caveat here is that developing nations only make up a fraction of all nations. So we still disproportionately use this resource, but it's not as uneven. Energy, same kind of story. 60% for developed countries, 40% for developing nations. And again, the developed nations make up a small portion of all countries. Paper. Oh, look at that paper number. 84% of developed nations use up 84% of the trees for paper, whereas developing nations only 16%. So the other important thing here is that resource depletion is something that we can have as a goal, something to solve, so that developing nations use less resources than they currently do, so these resources do not become depleted. Next, we're going to look at a very important concept, that is sustainability. Let's first define sustainability. It's the practice of living on Earth in a way that allows humans to use resources without depriving future generations of these resources. And the example shown here, which is in your textbook, is Easter Island. Easter Island is a small island in the Pacific, and you may have seen these statues that were built. And it was really quite a cultural engineering success that they moved these large slabs from a great distance up to a hilly or mountainous region, erected these statues, and carved them out. Many think that the people represented here on these statues were actual people who lived on Easter Island. But the lesson here is that the population of humans on Easter Island was wiped out. And there are multiple factors, and one that can't be discounted is the arrival of sailors from other countries that may have brought infectious diseases. But more so, it is believed that one of the main causes of the end of the civilization was the fact that it was originally a forested area, not as you see here, but forested with trees. And these trees were all chopped down to make boats, which is how the people who lived on Easter Island made a living fishing. But that when these trees were chopped down, it led to erosion. And eventually, two things happened. The trees were all taken up, so they didn't have any more for boats. And two, a lot of erosion happened, landslides and so forth. And through both of those situations, the civilization was wiped out. So what does that have to do with us? So we might like to think that we can be here forever, but if we don't practice a sustainable way of living, then our nature, our resources can become depleted, and we may not have what we need. We may not have what we need to survive. So I'm going to wrap up here with one more slide about sustainability, and that is that human well-being depends on sustainable practices. So in order to live sustainably, the environmental systems that we impact must not be damaged beyond their ability to recover. Renewable resources must not be depleted faster than they can regenerate. So in the example of Easter Island, the trees are a renewable resource, but if you deplete them faster than they can regrow or regenerate, they will become depleted. Next, non-renewable resources must be used sparingly, and we have to be able to carefully define what our needs are as humans. We don't want to return to the age of burning candles. Obviously, electricity is awesome, but can we define what we really need? Do we really need that Humvee to drive around? Can we meet our human needs by using a resource such as solar panels so that our human needs may be met? So we really have to think carefully about what needs are. So that's a wrap for this screencast. The next one will be on the scientific method.